Okay, good morning. First I want to thank, wow, I didn't realize how many people were here. Amazing. Okay, I have to go very quickly, we have 15 minutes. So I want to thank the organizers, Dr. Abdul Hadi, Dr. Saeed Abu and as well as the faculty and staff and students at An-Najah University. So I was planning to give a more theoretical talk about emancipatory pedagogies and decolonization. But then, we had a tour yesterday of the Abu Jihad Museum for the Prisoners Movement, and I saw a poster that caught my eye. And on the poster, one of the slogans was "Free the Land." And for me, I grew up saying "Free the Land," part of the political community I was a part of. That was one of the slogans that we used all the time when we said goodbye, "Free the land." And it was a moment of recognition and memory. So the elaborate title that you just heard read really comes down to a single question, and that is, what does it mean to teach Palestine from a Black Studies perspective? Now, Black Studies emerged around 1967-68 in the academy, at least, initially as a radical project conceived not only outside of the university, but in opposition to what was then a Eurocentric, and still is, Eurocentric university culture with ties to corporate and military power. Now, Palestine was there in Black Studies from its inception. And Dr. Rabah could also tell you about how her own department was founded as part of a College of Ethnic Studies, which came into being by a group called the Third World Liberation Front. And there's many examples. So by 1967, Third World and radicalized oppressed minorities in the US came to see the Arab-Israeli war as a war of dispossession. Israel as a colonial state backed by US imperialism, and Palestinians as victims of colonial subjugation. Now, this was a radical break from the past, contrary to the myth that African Americans or Black people and Palestinians were natural allies. Much of the Black world before that actually identified with Zionism through the Old Testament book of Exodus. Marcus Garvey himself identified his movement as Zionist. In the US and in the Caribbean, many leaders, most Black leaders and Black press embraced the founding of Israel because they recognized European Jews as an oppressed and homeless people determined to build a nation of their own. But it wasn't just Black intellectuals who gave Zionism a pass and ignored the Nakba. The left generally failed to see Israel as a colonial project, specifically a settler colonial state founded on the subjugation of indigenous and imported racialized labor. And part of this has to do with the sort of unique historical context for Israel's founding, as well as the power of its founding myths. So Israel, in the myth, was born as a nation identified as victims of colonial and racist violence, which gains its independence through insurrection against British rule. Now, of course, this narrative erases the violence of ethnic cleansing that was the Nakba. Israel's founding myth convinced even the most anti-colonial Black intellectuals to link Israel's independence with African independence and with Third World liberation. And at some point, even Israel's ruling party pursued alliances with newly independent African nations under the guise that they too were part of the non-aligned movement. And in fact, Israeli leaders were always quick to condemn racism around the globe. Ironically, the first person to describe Israel as an apartheid state, and some of you may know this, was South Africa's Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, who in 1961 said, Israel's the apartheid state. The Jews took Israel from the Arabs, and after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. So when I came to Black Studies during the late 70s and 80s, and I know it was a long time ago, but I'm a very old person, we emphasized the critique of power over identity politics. And the books we read were books by George Jackson. That was part of our curriculum. Back then, on the eve of the first Intifada, we regarded the PLO and the PFLP and other organizations as a vanguard in a global third world struggle for self-determination. Now remember, I should remember for all the young people, you won't remember this, but those were revolutionary times. I mean, in the 80s, there were struggles in South Africa, in Namibia, in Grenada, in the Congo, in the Western Sahara, everywhere, elsewhere, all on the horizon. Palestine stood on the front lines in a protracted battle against imperialism and what we then called settler capitalism. Palestinians were not victims in our book. They were armed revolutionary combatants and therefore models for those of us dedicated to black liberation and socialism. Insurgent social movements, however, met the university during its neoliberal term, when administrators in the US tried to capture ethnic studies and introduce liberal multiculturalism. The rise of a liberal kind of corporate multiculturalist discourse celebrated diversity and difference without ever addressing or seriously addressing racism, patriarchy, and structural inequalities. Ethnic cultures were the product of heritage, according to this discourse, that had to be respected and understood. Therefore, under the hegemony of corporate diversity discourse, ethnic studies programs flourished by the mid-1990s, and at least 700 universities had ethnic studies programs of some sort, mostly black studies. But these were programs that were shorn of a relationship with community, shorn of a relationship to social movements, which is exactly how black studies came into being in the first place. So the political culture also began to change. In South Africa, for example, when the United Democratic Front became the dominant political formation, revolution was pushed aside in favor of negotiation and compromise. And then we get Oslo, and I don't have to tell you that story. Human rights discourse was also ascendant, and intellectuals declared that we are now in a post-colonial moment. Especially with the spectacular violence of Israel's wars on Gaza, the killing of innocents was the focus of Palestine solidarity work. This played into the kind of deserving versus undeserving dead binary, which excluded those defending their territory in accordance with international law from any claims to human rights, foreclosing any serious conversation about the justifiable right to self-defense, let alone the right to wage a struggle against colonial domination. But we know that Western liberals are now pacifists. Sometimes they pretend to be. They're quick to arm rebels so long as they're the right rebels. The innocent child, the grandmother, the widow are the only Palestinians deserving of liberal sympathies, for they are ostensibly unburdened by political motives, even though they dream dreams of taking back the native land, of recovering stolen property, of enjoying the rights of citizenship and nationality and the right to return home, and bringing down Israel's apartheid state once and for all. But what about those dreams? Palestinian dreams, the black liberation dreams, freedom dreams. How did we move from a solidarity rooted in the commonalities of resistance to one based almost entirely on the commonalities of oppression? How do we move from a vision of liberation, a dream of building a post-Zionist, post-racist world, to a solidarity rooted in shared victimization? How has this limited our political imagination and how we teach Palestine or revolutionary movements more generally? The most recent trend in black studies emerging out of a kind of neoliberal identity politics is called Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism resurrects old colonial ideas in the guise of black radicalism. And it's a baffling analytical turn that strips black people of political agency, denies the saliency of class and class struggle, pits black struggles against anti-colonial struggles as if they're in opposition, and most of all, forecloses the possibility of cross-racial, ethnic, or national solidarity. And a particular variant of Afro-pessimism views the entire modern world founded on anti-black solidarity, and blackness is relegated to a permanent social death predicated on what one scholar calls modalities of accumulation and fungibility. So in this formulation, anti-blackness replaces racism, which not only severely limits our understanding of structural racism, but forecloses anti-racist solidarity, since all but authentic black people harbor or reproduce, if not depend on anti-blackness. Thankfully, it's not a dominant trend, nor is it insignificant. But then again, the kind of black Palestinian solidarity I've been talking about has never been a mass movement. Even now, with high-profile delegations, growing support for BDS, in groups like Black Lives, the Movement for Black Lives rather, and the extraordinary work of Blacks for Palestine, who you'll hear from later today, the numbers are still finding its place in Black Studies curriculum. So to come to some conclusion, besides combating Afro-pessimism, we need to reconnect Black study to social movements and existing anti-colonial struggles. And I say anti-colonial, I know it's old-fashioned, but I think it really matters. But to do this requires teaching Palestinian movements, not just BDS, but all manifestations of the liberation movement and their ideas, how analysis and critique is produced in struggle. It's not enough to study the daily humiliations of the checkpoints, Israel's apartheid wall, and the fortress-like West Bank settlements, home demolitions, the bombing of Gaza, or count the flow of US dollars funding occupation. A radical Black studies approach demands that we engage different sources, different archives, like the collection of prisoners' writings we encountered yesterday at the Abu Jihad Museum, the works of Palestinian intellectuals, as well as movement documents. This is not a dead history, but a living movement. And I can say from experience, having been already on 2 delegations to Palestine, that what impressed me most were the activists, the intellectuals, the youth, who spoke confidently about a liberated country, who saw the old guard leadership in the Palestinian Authority as impediments, who envisioned and debated a dozen different paths to democratic and a decolonized future. They did not all agree, but they struggled over these questions. And finally, as I learned yesterday, as Dr. Habu Hijale walked us through the cemetery, which was a very powerful, moving experience, to come to terms, to understand what a Black studies approach to Palestine means, it means to come to terms of what it means to be a martyr as opposed to a casualty. Thank you.